Take 5. 5 questions to authors and artists. With a common question, we get a personal perspective on what shapes their views. Simon Inglis, welcome to Audiobook Radio, and thanks for consenting to do our Take 5.
My pleasure.
To me, you're known as author of Sightlines, also because it was just such a great read. But I think you're better known as, or at least were better known, as a sports journalist and latterly an architectural historian. Now, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that transformation.
Yes, I started out as a sports writer in the early mid-80s, but gradually my love of architecture sort of took over, really. I studied history of architecture at university, and my delight was to be able to, say, visit a cathedral in the morning and a football ground in the afternoon. And gradually my interest of architecture sort of rose until the point came when I submitted an idea to a publisher. Let's do a book about the history and architecture of football grounds. It had never been done before. And to my amazement and delight, especially the publisher's delight, it was a huge success. And from about the mid-80s onwards, I became increasingly identified as a stadium author, if you like, somebody who wrote about the places of sport, really rather than sport itself. And I've been in that groove ever since, and now, for the last 10 years, have been editing books for English Heritage about sporting heritage in Britain.
So are we now up to date with when you're talking about the current books, these are the Played in Britain, Played in London series?
Played in Britain, yes. That was launched in 2004 by English Heritage. I've been editing ever since. We've done something like 15-20 books in the series so far, and just launched Played in London, which is our blockbuster, over 300 pages, weighs a ton, and has just been shortlisted for the William Hill Sports Book of the Year. Fantastic. So we're on a bit of a roll at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I loved looking at it. It was like a definitive kind of history of so many aspects of London that, as a Londoner with well over 50 years of living in the city, I was just so surprised at so many different things and aspects, not just certain areas, but certain sports and certain places.
I think you are typical. There are so many people. One of the most common responses to the Played in Britain series that we get is somebody will say, do you know, I've lived round the corner from that bowls club for the last 30 years and I didn't know it was there. Or that tennis pavilion that I drive past every night on the way back from home. I never knew what its real purpose or what its origins had been. And this happens a lot. I think so many of course we all know the Wembleys and the Wimbledons and the Twickenhams of this world, but interlaced throughout the sort of the urban matrix, this network, there's something like over 3,000 clubs in London alone. We've made nearly 1,000 field trips to various places around the city, and of course some of them are very ordinary and not particularly of interest, but there are so many that have got a really lovely story to tell, not just about their sport but about the communities in which they are, often founded by the Victorians or Edwardians at a time when the suburbs were growing. Tennis clubs are a very good example of places that were really there to create an identity and a meeting place for all these people who'd come into the city and were starting afresh, starting in a new place and wanted to meet other people. And they were tremendous. They acted like a glue to these new communities. And really from about the middle of the 19th century onwards, sport has been used not just by communities but by local authorities and by governments, by the state, to bring people together and of course to solve all the other ills of society. When everything goes wrong, when people start to get overweight, where there are health issues, where there are social issues, where there is social unrest, the powers that be follow in afterwards, and what is it that they're putting in? Playing fields, pavilions, sports clubs, youth clubs, to try and get people active. This has been going on for hundreds of years.
It sounds like such an obvious, but as I say, it was really well illuminated in your book, and an area I never really thought. But listen, we should get on to take 5.
Indeed.
So the same 5 questions, and the first of which is there a book that actually inspired you to write?
I think I would say that there is a book that inspired me to do the work that I do, and to suggest that this could be done in book form. And it was a very basic book. We're going back to the late 50s, early 60s now. There was a wonderful Czech artist called Miroslav Sasek, who produced a book called This is London. First of all, I think it was in 1959-60, around that period. And I was bought a copy of his follow-up book called This is Edinburgh, which I think came out in around 1961. Now, the total word count for that book is probably no more than 300 words.
Okay.
But there are pictures which he drew on every page. And that link between the picture capturing a part of a city, a building or a person or a cityscape, and just attaching to it 3 or 4 words or a couple of sentences, just for me brought the notion alive that you could encapsulate a city, a mood of a city, just in a few pictures and in a few words. Subsequently, this series, has been reissued, and you can now buy it in modern bookshops. I prefer mine to be the vintage copies. But he was a chap who looked at cities and said, look at that. Just stop for a minute and look at that image. Isn't that wonderful? Doesn't that tell you something about the mood and the character of a city? So from the age of about 5 or 6 onwards, actually, what my passion was not so much sport, but it was cities and buildings and places, what we would call a love of place.
Did you say drawings rather than photos?
Yes, they were coloured pen and ink drawings, very modern, cartoon-like, and yet architecturally quite accurate. He was very good at the colour range of the city, and we're talking about the late 50s, early 60s. So even it has a sort of Kodachrome sort of timely feel to it. There aren't the vibrant colours that you would get, for example, from a printed children's book today. Single picture on a white page with just a single caption. Not a book to read, but a book to browse and to flick through. And you could say that my work is exactly that, 30, 40 years on. It's just the captions have got longer, and I don't do my own drawings, whereas I prefer to use photography. But it's taking that single image of a scene in a city, a cityscape, and saying, this is where you live, or this is what this city looks like. I don't like to use the term that a lot of people have used recently when thinking of the works of people like Ian Sinclair, of psychogeographer, the kind of stuff that is involves somebody walking around a city and intellectualizing about what is around them. For me, a picture and a caption says so much, and it's the way I personally react to cities, and therefore if I'm interested in it, then I want other people to be interested in it. So there's a sort of a level of didacticism in me. There's a level of sort of the teacher of saying, come on everybody, get out the house, get your shoes on, we're going for a walk, and have a look at what's around you. Take notice of what's around you. I was very lucky. I had an art history teacher who told me at the age of 13 or 14 that the most important thing was to go out and to look up. Not to walk with your head down on the pavement, but to look up at your surroundings.
Wise words. So was it your introduction to Edinburgh, or did you already know the city and it kind of like...
No, never been there. My father was from Edinburgh, and I had 2 grandparents in Birmingham when I grew up who were Scottish. A lot of my relatives were Scottish. We're from a Scottish Jewish family. So I grew up thinking that all Scottish people were Jewish. And conversely, that all Jewish people were Scottish. So I fell in love absolutely with Scotland from an early age. I didn't get there till I was about 12, I think. But we've done a book in our series, for example, Played in Glasgow, in the Played in Britain series, which I just loved researching because I was sort of following in the footsteps of my grandparents and even my great-grandfather who'd settled in Glasgow in the 1870s. So somewhere within my genes there was this love affair with Scotland.
And is there a book that you wish you had written?
There are many. I mean, obviously 50 Shades of Grey, who wouldn't want to have written a book that's such a bestseller? When you're working as a writer, you're thinking of ideas the whole time, and of course you can never complete them all. And there's always a book that comes out and you think, damn, that author has beaten me to it. And one came out last year, but it was written by a very good friend of mine, so I didn't feel so bad about it. His name is Mark Mason, and it was called Move Along, Please. And it was a non-fiction tale of how he took public transport, buses. He took local buses from Land's End to John O'Groats, taking different routes as he went up the country, paying his fares and taking a half-hour hop here, an hour there, going right up through the country over the course of a month or so. I'd love to have done that. For me, I am happiest when I'm on the top deck of a bus on the front seat, just going through a town or a city, watching the countryside, the city go past. Mark did it, and all power to him. But yeah, that's the one I really wanted to have written. Move Along, Please, by Mark Mason.
Nice one. Yeah,
lovely
it's a lovely
book.
idea. It's really charming, even just the basis of it. So is there any subject that you think doesn't belong between the covers of a book?
The simple answer is no. Books are about life, about the world, about us. So you can't exclude anything, and you shouldn't exclude anything. Even if you don't agree with it, it should be there. Come on, we're fighting wars for freedom of speech. As we speak, there are people dying in the cause of freedom of speech. So no, everything must be allowed, even if we don't approve of it. We have to give our point of view, but we also have to understand other people's points of view. And the written word is so important in that process. Absolutely no boundaries as far as I'm concerned, however hateful we might find those views.
Okay. What about a book that you'd like read to you? I mean, do you have any contact with audiobooks, and does it appeal, the idea of a voice?
I love the idea of being read to. I mean, it goes back to our youth, doesn't it? Having my father tell us stories. He often didn't read, but he made up stories. So, of course, that's part of the whole thing of being a child again, of lying in bed and hearing a voice, a soothing voice. I like to hear stories that have a bit of colour and sort of, I wouldn't say action, but atmosphere. I'm particularly fond of an author. This is going to sound very strange. An author called R.S. Surtees, who wrote in the middle of the 19th century popular novels about hunting. Now,
sounds very strange.
It is very
totally
strange.
Bizarre that you'd want it read out, especially.
Well, because he was a sort of satirist, although he loved hunting, he captured the spirit of mid-Victorian England very, very cleverly, in a way that you would associate with Dickens or with Wilkie Collins. He was of that period, that generation, who described in great detail what everybody was wearing, or what they were eating, or the rooms, or the pub, or the inn where they stayed. And he captured with a sort of a real glint in his eye, so that there was always a sense that although he was trying to appeal to his hunting audience, at the same time he was writing for all those other people who were saying, aren't these people awful? It was real English sort of satire and a way of encapsulating a time which I think as the years go by and people become more familiar with photography and film and then radio, the broadcast word, television and so on, writers can make more assumptions about what you know. But he was writing at a time when industrialisation was just coming in. People were taking trains for the first time and coaches were dying off. It was a crucial period, as important then as the digital age is now, in terms of what comes before and what was coming after. He was sort of writing about the pre-electrical world, if you like, an analogue world in which the railways were just starting to transform the way we lived. If I was going to, he only wrote about 7 or 8 novels. And the one that is my favourite is Mr. Sponge's Sporting Tour, which he wrote in 1853, which is basically about a Londoner who likes hunting and sets off around the country, sponging off the landed gentry, staying at them for 3 or 4 days at a time, drinking their wine, hunting with their horses, and basically living off the fat of the land. Rambunctious, very irreverent, often very funny, very cutting. The only trouble is it might keep me awake, and you know, with an audio book you have to really concentrate, otherwise you just sort of gradually drop off. So I'd want it to be read by someone with real gusto to keep my attention.
It sounds like a fascinating book, but is there a reason why you'd want it read out rather than read it yourself? In as much as, you know, is there a rhythm to it potentially?
Yes.
Or, I mean, are there...
There really is. The clacking of the wheels, the long journeys in the coaches, the getting out, the hubbub of a round of an inn when the coach arrives and everyone has to be put up and food found, and then they meet for the hunt, and there's the rhythm of the hunt itself. I'm completely anti-hunting. You know, I'm discussing this as a historical phenomenon, not as something I personally want to do. But there is something of the idea of all these people on their horses, bounding through the countryside, and some of them falling and getting splattered in mud, of the ladies catching the attention of the men as they ride side saddle and being a little bit racy, you know, and of the lord of the manor falling flat on his face on the side of in a field, and the fox getting away. He writes with that sort of rhythm, so you get caught up in a sort of almost breathless journey over 7, 8, 9, 10 miles across the country, and then you've got the calm after the kill, and then the going back to the house afterwards, and the drinking, and then the cold morning that follows. So yes, it does. It does have a real pace to it, a bit like describing perhaps a Grand Prix race.
Yeah, you've made it sound enormously appealing, and like you say, it did sound very bizarre to begin with, but yeah, I might check that out. Okay, finally, now in the days before print, do you think you would have been a storyteller? Which I'm particularly interested to hear, because on one level you're talking about, you know, things being so visual, but on another, you know, you mentioned this sort of didactic quality where you do want to kind of get people thinking and looking. But I was wondering if that would translate to storytelling.
I would hope so. My family would certainly say so, because I'm forever, when I'm out with them, saying, now, look at that building. Now, the man who built that building, or that building was built in such and such a day, and if you go round the corner and you have a look at that, I'm forever doing that and boring people rigid with it. So, yes, I fear that I would have been quite the same.
But if we're talking about the days before print, we're talking about maybe the days before buildings, or many of them. So do you think you'd still be a storyteller kind of round the campfire? Oh,
it doesn't have to be a building. It could be a fence post. It could be a gate. It could be a field. It could be a hill. It could be a mountain. It's the environment in which we live. It is being sensitive to your environment. Some people, when they engaged with the arts, they engage in a specific way. Some people are touched by classical music. I'm not. Some people are touched by jazz or by R&B. I am. I like the sound of drums. I respond perhaps a little bit more to the colour red than the colour blue. I like a curry, but I don't like a feta salad. I like lamb, but I don't like faggots, for example. All of us, our bodies, our souls, our heads, our complete makeup are entirely different. We're all wired up in different ways. And the way that I am wired up, I am very acutely aware of space. and my surroundings. I respond to my surroundings. And because I love talking, I will talk about my surroundings. They're very important to me. I mean, I guess had I been wired very slightly differently, I might have been an architect or an engineer or an interior decorator or a painter or a cartoonist. I mean, of course, I'd love to be all these things. Of course. Actually, I'd love to be a graphic designer. Really. I'd like to do all these things, but that sense of place is so important to me, and that's why I love cities. Well, there's nowhere I don't like, really. I mean, even the back end of town in an industrial estate in the middle of Catford has its interest. If you look and if you think and you realise where you are and what you're doing, you might not want to stay there very long, but it's still worth seeing, I think. It doesn't have to be beautiful to be interesting. So yes, I think I probably would have still been that person who couldn't resist telling everybody what I thought about where I was at that particular time. I mean, that's what writers do, isn't it, really? They have the conceit to believe that somebody else is going to be interested in what they say. And that's what I do. All my books, really, are not because I've spotted a gap in the market and I've said, I think we could do a book on this because, nobody else has done it before. I've done them all because I've thought, I'm interested in this. I want to find out more. And as long as I'm interested, I have that conceit that somebody else will be interested. And of course, if I'm not interested, that will show in the words. If your heart is not in the sentence, or as the old expression goes, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got swing. That's, for me, what it's all about. If I can't make you interested in a subject, then there's no point in me writing it down. I've got to work to get your attention, to say, hey, come here, look at this. Isn't that interesting? That's what I do.
Simon, long may you be swinging. Thank you so much.
Thank
that was
you.
Great.